United States military blockade of Iranian ports is now stretching into its third day as the White House continues its bid to put economic pressure on Tehran. U.S. Central Command said yesterday that no ships made it past the blockade in the first 24 hours, adding that 6 merchant vessels had complied with directions by radio from U.S. forces to turn around and re-enter Iranian ports, although it did not identify the ships or the ports. CENTCOM also noted the mission involves 10,000 American troops, more than a dozen warships, and an array of aircraft. As the Pentagon publicly portrays confidence in the blockade, there are signals, however. Some ships may be testing the waters. The New York Times reports, citing ship tracking data, that one vessel under U.S. sanctions, the Chinese tanker Rich Starry, traveled eastward through the strait yesterday before turning around. Another Iran-linked ship also appeared to make it through the strait during the blockade, but the paper notes the vessel was offline yesterday, so it was not clear what its path had been. The Wall Street Journal cites 2 U.S. officials who say more than 20 commercial ships not linked to Iran have passed through the strait over the past day, a fraction of what it was before the war, but an improvement in flow through the critical waterway. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports the Pentagon is sending thousands of additional troops to the Middle East in the coming days. According to U.S. officials who spoke to the Post, the move is designed to pressure Iran into a deal. The Trump administration is still considering additional strikes or possible ground operations if the ceasefire does not hold. Current and former officials tell the paper about 6,000 more troops will be added to the already assembled 50,000 personnel in the region. That all comes as behind-the-scenes talks to set up more in-person negotiations between the United States and Iran continue. President Trump said yesterday negotiations could resume over the next 2 days, possibly being held once again in Pakistan's capital. So, Joe, let's talk about the blockade, what these developments mean, and then we'll get to the issue of troops heading there.
Well, you know, talking to people in the region yesterday, U.S. allies, and again, may have been reluctant originally for us to go to war, but after we went to war saying we've got to finish the job, there was a growing unease that the United States was going to get a bad deal in Islamabad. There was a growing unease that the president may come home, bring the troops home before getting the job done. They are actually very positive about the blockade and have signed on to what I am sure historians will long remember as the Haas plan. The Richard Haas plan, who Richard 10 days ago started saying it's all or nothing. You either let all of the ships go in and out of the strait, or you let none of them go out. They believe the dynamics have changed radically, and that Iran went from having time on their side to Iran now understanding they are going to have to eventually come to a deal. Because, as we've always said from the beginning of this war, the military targets have been hit in Iran, a good number of them. But economically, Iran was doing better trading oil and moving their oil across the globe and getting good money for it than they had in years. That's now changed. So the attitude, not only inside the administration, but also among a lot of Gulf allies now is they're degraded radically when it comes to their military operations. And now they're really starting to feel the heat economically if the United States, they say, will continue the blockade. A lot of other things happening. Let's bring in contributing editor at the Financial Times, Kim Ghattas. Kim, we can talk about the blockade, we can talk about the troops coming in, but of course, what is also fascinating is direct talks now between Lebanon and Israel. Tell us about that, the prospects of it, and if it may bring an end to the suffering that's going on in your country.
Good morning, Joe. Great to be with you. Yes, we saw talks yesterday at the U.S. State Department in the presence of the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, between the Lebanese ambassador to Washington and the Israeli ambassador to Washington. There in the picture, Nada Hamadi, the Lebanese ambassador, the woman, and also in the presence of the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon. And I mentioned the Israeli ambassador to Washington. It is a first since the 1980s when Lebanon negotiated an agreement with Israel after Israel had invaded Lebanon and gone all the way up to Beirut. So yet again, Lebanon is negotiating a ceasefire or negotiating or beginning a process, as Marco Rubio said, to discuss a potential ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. But the circumstances are very different because the war is still ongoing, although it's decreased somewhat in intensity at the moment, I think at the request of the United States. And it is a very difficult and somewhat controversial move in Lebanon itself to negotiate under fire with Israel at this moment in time. It is important, though, because Lebanon's never really had a seat at the table in regional negotiations. It has never really been able to speak in its own name. It has always been either under the control of Syria, which occupied Lebanon for 30 years, or more recently, it has been subjected to sort of Iranian pressure, which wants to take over negotiations or Lebanon's seat at the table. And so although I think this process is going to be very difficult and we can get into the details, the key about this is that Lebanon is at the table and not on the menu, and certainly not part of Iran's own negotiating track. It's important for Lebanon to show up as a sovereign country to the extent that it can.
Can I ask you to put some context to what we're seeing in America, where we see Netanyahu's endless war continue. We see the bombing of Lebanon. We see the suffering out of that's coming from that bombing. Can you put some context to it? At the beginning of this war, you talked about how many people in Lebanon very angry at Hezbollah for dragging the country into the war with some of the things Hezbollah said and did. I'm curious, what's your best take from what you're hearing on the ground on how successful this bombing campaign is in degrading Hezbollah's effectiveness versus the civilian casualties that seem to be piling up?
The civilian casualties are piling up. Last week, we had a day of carnage in Beirut, just as the ceasefire with Iran was coming into effect. We had 100 strikes in just 10 minutes across the country, a country the size of Connecticut, many of them focused on Beirut. I had friends who were affected, whose apartment building was hit, friends of friends who lost their parents. It was really devastating for Lebanon. As I said, also, not only is it a small country, but we've been through so much over the last few years, including a war with Israel between Hezbollah and Israel, which affects the whole of Lebanon just a year and a half ago. And even during the period of the ceasefire, which was attained in November of 2024 between Lebanon and Israel, since then and the eruption of this war, Israeli strikes continued. Lebanon feels that it is really stuck between this Israeli bombing campaign to try to degrade or decapitate Hezbollah, which is an endless task if you don't have politics and diplomacy to accompany it. Stuck between that and stuck between Iran's holding on to one of its key negotiating cards in the region with the United States, which is Hezbollah, a Shia militant group in Lebanon, which is also a political party in the country. So Lebanon feels very much stuck between those two. And going forward, yes, Lebanon will be at the table, but the concern in Lebanon is that Israel is not going to stop striking the country, and so the Lebanese government may risk being seen with those negotiations as giving cover to those strikes, and that is going to be a very, very difficult balance to manage.
Kim, the next question I ask is going to sound like a leading question. It is not a leading question. I'm just curious. We see these strikes against apartments. We see these strikes against residential areas from Israel, from Netanyahu's forces. into Lebanon, and we hear that they're degrading Hezbollah. Of course, when Vladimir Putin does that in Ukraine, we all rightly call it a war crime. I'm curious, when you're talking about your relatives and your friends and friends of friends who've lost their parents, the innocent civilians who are being killed here, I need to better understand what does Benjamin Netanyahu think he's doing in degrading Hezbollah by having these random strikes? What's Israel's logic? How does bombing apartments in the middle of Lebanon, how does that degrade Hezbollah?
So I want to be very careful with how I answer this question, because some of these strikes are not random, and certainly Israel insists that they are not random, that they were targeting very specific Hezbollah members or commanders, and in many cases, that is indeed what happened, that in some of these civilian neighborhoods, members of Hezbollah, relatives of high-ranking commanders, in one case we had IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran, checked into a hotel. That is why the anger in Lebanon is growing, is because members of Hezbollah are operating across many parts of the country where they don't usually operate. That does not justify targeting areas that are civilian. That does lead you into terrain of illegality, and the civilian toll is very real. So Israel can justify that as what they call collateral damage, but those are lives that are being taken, and that should, not have people who should not have died. And so it's a very difficult balance. As I said, Lebanon really feels stuck between Israel's military advantage and capacity, and Iran and Hezbollah's disregard for the Lebanese civilian toll.